Hello, and welcome to North Country Matters. My name is Donna Seymour. I'm a member of the St. Lawrence County League of Women Voters, one of the civic partners for this show. Today, we are talking with Corrine Carey, the New York and New Jersey campaign director for Compassionate Choices, an organization that advocates for legislation to permit terminally ill people to request medication to end their lives. Corrine, welcome to North Country Matters.
Thank you so much for having me, Donna.
Well, you're welcome. You and I have actually worked together before a number of years ago on the Women's Equality Agenda campaign. And for the last 7 years, you've been working to help pass the Medical Aid in Dying Act, first introduced in the New York State Legislature in 2016. 10 other states actually already have some form of this legislation. And in fact, the Oregon Death with Dignity Act has been in effect for more than 20 years. Tell folks a little bit about how you came to work on this campaign and what the Compassion and Choices organization actually is and does.
Sure. So I'm a civil rights attorney and a policy analyst. And for many years, I worked on a large portfolio of public health issues, reproductive rights, privacy related to medical records. And I started teaching a class in New York City on the politics of health. And it was right around the time that the Affordable Care Act was being debated. And as you recall, there was a myth that was circulated that the Affordable Care Act would establish death panels. And the rhetoric around that was so heated that I actually used that as an example for my class and started talking about the idea of providing a code to doctors so that they could have conversations with people about what they valued at the end of life. And the rhetoric around that was just so absurd that I started really diving into why people were so afraid of talking about death and dying. And right around that time, I read the amazing book by Atul Gawande, Being Mortal. And my father was also diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. So it just so happened that there was this confluence of factors that got me thinking really deeply about how we deal with death and dying in this country. It was around the time that Brittany Menard, the young woman from California who was diagnosed with a brain tumor, shared her story in People magazine of wanting the option of medical aid in dying. And so all of these things were swirling, and Compassionate Choices happened to be looking for a New York campaign organizer. And I thought, well, this is my chance to focus on one important issue as opposed to dispersing my energies in a lot of different directions. And so I took over the campaign in 2015. And as you mentioned, the bill was introduced in 2016. At that time, there were a number of legislative proposals circulating, sponsored by both Democrats and Republicans. And so when I took this campaign, I gathered all of the lawmakers, all of the advocates together, and we talked about what was working in other states. And at that point, only, I believe, 4 states had legalized medical aid in dying in 2015. And so the bill was hammered out with all of these advocates and lawmakers looking at the best evidence and what works for New York. And the New York Medical Aid in Dying Act was introduced in the spring of 2016. And that's the bill that we are still pushing forward today, just about 7.5 years later.
Well, it's true that the states model legislation that can then be used in other places. So the fact that you had some other states to model your legislation on has kind of helped this process along here in New York, and what happens here will be useful for other states going down the road, won't it?
That's right. That's right. And in fact, we now have 10 states plus Washington, D.C. that have legalized medical aid in dying. And I ran the campaign in New Jersey for this option. The law passed in 2019. It went into effect in August of 2019. And so now we have really a close-up glimpse at what it looks like to have a medical aid in dying in a populous eastern state that has, some similar demographics to New York. And we're also seeing that we've got folks downstate near New York City that are watching their neighbors access this option right across the river. We've got people in the North Country who are watching their neighbors in Vermont access this law. It's a mountain, it's a zip code, it's a bridge that divides New Yorkers from this right when we're surrounded by by New Jersey, by Maine, by Vermont, who allow terminally ill people this compassionate end of life option.
Yeah, thank you, Corrine. So let's give folks an idea about what medical aid in dying actually is so that there's no confusion about what we're talking about here.
Sure. Medical aid in dying is a time-tested process that allows a terminally ill individual to ask their doctor for a prescription for medication that they can take at a time of their choosing to relieve needless suffering and to die peacefully. That is simply, Donna, what this bill would do. It would give people an option. There are more than a dozen safeguards attached to this bill that include the following. Terminal illness is defined in the bill as an illness that is incurable and irreversible. So this is not something for someone who is just dissatisfied with their life or the quality of their life. This is for someone who is close to death. And that's really the marker for hospice eligibility across the country. New York is a little bit enlightened in this regard. And so we allow people to access hospice services when they have a year or less to live. But in most states, it's 6 months or less. And so that's really the bright line. So that is one of the safeguards. 2 doctors have to confirm the terminal illness, the prognosis of 6 months or less to live, and the mental capacity to make this decision. And if either of those doctors have any doubts about the person's capacity, they have to refer the person to a mental health provider for an assessment. And no prescription can be written for medical aid in dying medication unless and until that mental health provider certifies that the person has the capacity to make this decision. 2 witnesses have to witness the written request. The person has to make both an oral request and a written request. And, the other safeguard that I'd like to highlight is that this process is entirely voluntary for everyone, for the patient, for the doctor, the pharmacist, and any other healthcare provider, hospice workers, et cetera. It's entirely voluntary, so that when this law passes in New York, and I believe that it will, it's just a matter of how much suffering lawmakers will allow to continue. Nothing changes for people who don't agree with medical aid in dying, but everything changes for the terminally ill person who has the kind of death profile that has them suffering for a long period of time. This is, for example, certain types of cancer when people have been on pain medication for a very long time. Some neurodegenerative diseases involve very long suffering that can't be alleviated with palliative care and hospice services. So everything changes for those folks. And I do want to stress that voluntary aspect. From start to finish, it is the patient that's in control of this process. From the initial request to taking the medication, they have to be able to ingest the medication on their own. It is the patient and the patient alone. No healthcare proxy, no doctor, no family member can make this decision for the dying person. So that's what we're talking about here.
Well, those safeguards are really important, and you've outlined them very well. And I think many of us have watched what has happened when we've had a family member, a very close personal friend, go through a terminal illness, and the ability to alleviate suffering, that they can make that decision on their own, would be such peace of mind, not only for the person but the person's family. Once this is an option for people, because there's nothing harder than watching a loved one suffer, and no, there is no recourse for alleviating that suffering until they actually die. And it's a very, very hard thing for people to go through. So I appreciate the fact that you've worked so hard on this campaign and for so long. And, hopefully we will get to the point where this will actually get passed here in New York State. So let's talk a little bit, Corinne. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to add to what you just said, because you're absolutely right about this peace of mind. What we've learned from, more than a quarter of a century of evidence is that not only have the safeguards worked, but also close to a third of people who get the prescription in states that authorize it never take the medication. It is simply the peace of mind of knowing that if their suffering becomes too great, there's a door, there's a way out of that suffering. And that is tremendously comforting for people and their families to be able to have some degree of control when the illness has robbed all other kinds of control from you.
Yeah, thank you. That's an important point. Let's talk a little bit about what options currently exist at the end of life, and do those options go far enough to alleviate the suffering of terminally ill people? I know hospice, had hospice in my own family, so we know how wonderful they are and how important palliative care is, but it doesn't really go quite far enough, does it?
No, it really doesn't. People, when they're given a diagnosis of a terminal illness, have a number of different options in front of them. They could pursue every treatment available until the very end. There are people out there that are fighters and they want to do everything, including experimental treatment, and people have the right, limited, of course, by your finances, to do that. You could also refrain from treatment at any point. You could say, enough is enough. I have had enough and I'm going to decline further treatment. You could also ask for help in voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. And so if you've stopped curative treatment and you are looking at, a prolonged dying process, you can say, I'm going to start withholding food and nutrition. And people can do that with medical support. It's very difficult to do it without medical support, but people have done it. So that is an option that's been affirmed by the Supreme Court that people in New York and across the country can do. In some severe cases where people are continuing to suffer and lingering, they can ask for help with what's called palliative sedation or deep sedation at the end of life, which is basically putting someone in a medical coma while nutrition and hydration are withheld. So that is another option that people have. And while they're doing any and all of these things, they could also be pursuing palliative care. You don't have to give up curative treatment in order to access palliative care. Palliative care relieves symptoms and makes people more comfortable. Hospice, you can't actually pursue curative treatment and also gain access to hospice services. And you're right, with regard to your own family, when my father died, our family received hospice services, and I don't know that we would have been able to get through it with as much grace as we did. But for some people, even all of that support is not enough, and they linger and they suffer. And hospice workers know it well themselves. People ask for help to die. And what we're dealing with in situations like that is that, you're there as a family member and you've got a healthcare provider giving you the medication to administer to your loved one. Sometimes it's called a comfort pack. It's called different things in different places. And you're told, give your loved one as much as they need to keep them comfortable. But you also know, either explicitly or implicitly, that if you give them too much, you might be able to bring about death. And so this power in the hands of a loved one is so great, Donna. If your loved one is suffering and you give them that last dose of morphine or the other medication and they die, forever you associate that you gave them that last dose of medication that has caused them to die. No matter what the intent, no matter what your loved one wanted at that point, it's a heavy burden to carry. But imagine if you don't give enough, then you're watching your loved one suffer, gasp for breath, beg for pain relief. And the worst of it is, and this is sort of the dark side of this equation, is that we're giving this power to family members, and it's not the dying person who's making the decisions. It's actually the loved one or the family member or, the person providing care. And it just shouldn't be like that. We know that there are people who administer large doses of medication at the end, whether it's physicians or family members. Shouldn't the dying person be in charge of that, of making their wishes known and being able to provide for themselves at that point?
And of course, that's exactly what this legislation would allow for, isn't it? So we know that even in the course of normal legislation, it takes time to create an awareness of what the problem is, as well as then to build the consensus that action needs to be taken. Is there a broad understanding by the public of the need for this kind of law? And do you think the needed consensus for this legislation is also taking place in the state legislature?
Well, I would say that polling has shown time and time again that the vast majority of New Yorkers and Americans across the country think that terminally ill people should have this option. So the polling has only gotten stronger. And in fact, we wondered what the COVID pandemic would do to that polling, right? Because before it was hard to get people to talk about death and dying. Now, after, what are we going on 3 years of this pandemic? You can't get away from it. Daily we were seeing the tallies, we were seeing the faces and the names, and in our own families and lives, we were losing people. So we couldn't escape discussions about death and dying. And I think what the pandemic taught people is what they really value at the end of life. They value touch. They value being with their loved ones. They value communication about what was important at the end of life. And a lot of those things were stripped from people as they entered emergency rooms. And so I think there's a deeper and richer understanding of what kind of death we all want for ourselves and for our loved ones. And it's not being isolated, and it's not being in pain. As you well know, though, polling numbers alone are not enough to pass a law. If that were true, a lot of these legislative campaigns wouldn't take decades to pass. So 7 years is a long time, and we've lost advocates who've walked the hallways in Albany and attended Zoom meetings and come to the state fair to table with us. These are folks that died in a tremendous amount of pain, using their last weeks and months to beg legislators for this option. So it's too long from that perspective. But when you look at how legislation gets passed in Albany, 7 years is around an average for a bill of this kind of magnitude. What we've been doing is building support among lawmakers. Now, we ended the session last year with more than 72 bill sponsors, and those bill sponsors were incredibly diverse: upstate, downstate, people of color, lawmakers that have been around for decades, newly elected lawmakers, progressives, moderates. And we've had amazing conversations with conservative Republicans behind closed doors. None of them have put their names on the bill. But we are going to see historic turnover in the legislature this year. So in some ways, we're going to be starting with a fresh slate with a lot of new members, and we're going to have to track and do all of this education all over again to let them know what medical aid in dying is, where the support is from, and what kind of opposition we're looking at. So it's a tough road ahead, but we've made an incredible amount of progress. And I think we've elevated this issue to one of the top issues that lawmakers need to deal with when they return in 2023.
Well, you make a good point about the fact that there will be new people going to Albany. That's certainly true here in the North Country. We've got some retirements and some new folks going. Regardless of how the election turns out, there will be some changes. What do you see as the main roadblocks to passage of this bill going forward?
So there are some who believe that that this is a decision better left to God, frankly. And, I come from a strong Irish Catholic family, and our family, many of them do believe that. And as I said before, when this bill passes, medical aid in dying would probably not even be a conversation for members of my family. But we also understand that we shouldn't be standing in the way of other people's choices. So that is one of the biggest roadblocks. Another is that some people believe that allowing for medical aid in dying devalues the quality of life for people, or I guess devalues life for those who can identify with the lack of quality of life that people who are terminally ill suffer. So, for example, there are some people living with disabilities that say, I encountered the same limitations as terminally ill people, and so passing this law would devalue my life. And what I say to that is that this is fundamentally different. There are people who experience all kinds of limitations in their lives, and they adapt and they go on to live very rich and fulfilling lives because they know that this is a new normal for them. And, we have a long way to go in this country to making sure that our medical systems and our public accommodations are sufficient to give people what they need to live that full and engaging life. But for terminally ill people, the only thing that's down the road is a death soon, and many times an excruciating pain. And, when someone gets a 6-month prognosis, it is more likely than not that they are closer to death than 6 months, because doctors sometimes don't want to give up on people. And so you're given a 6-month prognosis, but in reality, you may have weeks or even days to live. That was the case of my own dad. When he got a 6-month prognosis, he had 72 hours left to live. So many people experience that. And so this notion that, you may be misdiagnosed or you may be given, less time than you have, the research doesn't bear that out. Doctors who are wrong in their prognostication are wrong in overestimating how much time people have. So I do want to make that distinction that, dying people have a different outlook for the rest of their lives than people who are limited in other ways in their capacity.
I think that's a really good point. And as you were speaking, it occurred to me that the organization is called Compassion and Choices, and that really is such a good description of what we're talking about, is to show compassion and to give people choices that they may or may not choose to actually act on, but they have the choice. You're going to take Compassionate Choices on the road for a winter tour to discuss these ideas directly with the public. Tell us about that campaign, please.
Yeah, we are going to bring this fight to lawmakers in their home districts. We've been for a very long time focusing our activities on bringing people to Albany, and now we're going to bring this campaign and all of its energy to 6 different regions of the state. We're going to be holding press conferences in every region, candlelight vigils, programming. We're going to be doing a lot of listening from communities that still have questions about this legislation. And you're right, our first tourist stop is the North Country. I love going up there. We've got some really strong supporters there, and we're going to be doing programs in 3 different churches and a press conference in the Olympic Village. We've chosen iconic locations across the state to do these press conferences to show that in every area of this wide and diverse and beautiful state, there are people who are begging their elected officials for this option. So we're going to start out with a press conference on Wednesday, November 16th at the North Elba Town Hall, right in the Olympic Village. And we're going to ask supporters to gather there in, carrying photos of their loved ones and handmade signs, and call on elected officials to take this up as a priority in 2023.
Well, I think that's really smart. And, one of the things that COVID has opened the door to is Zoom lobbying, because it used to be that if an organization wanted to have a lobby day, you gathered your supporters and you went to Albany, but that hasn't really been an option the last 3 years. So we've all learned to be advocates at home and reach out in a different way. So I think you've really hit on something that's important, and taking it around the state is a good idea, because it's sometimes easy to dismiss everything as, oh, that Albany wants that or New York City wants that. We need to show that every part of this state is interested in this issue, and we need to talk to our legislators about it. So I think that's a great idea. How can people learn more, and how can they help in this effort?
Yep, join us, and you can find us on Facebook, Compassion and Choices New York, and we post all of the activities that we're doing on Facebook and links for people to take easy action in contacting their lawmakers. We're also, you can find us on the web, compassionandchoices.org/New York, and you can find my contact information on that page as well. If you email me, if you'd like to share your story with lawmakers, and if you don't want to get involved in an organization, just simply ask the candidates who are asking you for your vote where they stand on this issue. If it's after the election, get in touch with the people who represent you in the Assembly and the Senate and tell them that you want to make this a priority, and that when they come to Albany for the start of the 2023 session in January, that this should be one of the first things on their list.
And that's a really important point, because we will be sending new people to Albany. They don't really have the benefit of the experience of the region that they're in, and because of redistricting, many of them are representing areas that they're not familiar with themselves. So having constituents contact them and say, this is a priority for me, is going to be very important in the next few months as they get ready to go to Albany and start the new session in January. That's a
right.
good point. So,
Wow.
Corrine, as we wrap up, any final thoughts you'd like to leave our viewers with?
You know, our state is facing so many really important issues. I mean, if you look at the polling, what's important to people? It's the economy, it's crime, it's social justice, it's reproductive rights and bodily autonomy. I want to make 2 points about that. This is a bodily autonomy issue. If you think that, the attacks on bodily autonomy are stopping with reproductive rights, you're mistaken. There are factions of this country that want control over every aspect of our lives. And the fight for bodily autonomy needs to include this fight for rights at the end of life. And the other thing I'll mention is that among all of those priorities that people have, having a good, peaceful death doesn't generally rise to one of them. I'll admit that. No one looks at this unless you've really had a loved one suffer and says, this is one of my top 10 issues. So it's not really a priority, so to speak, for anyone until it is. Until you have that loved one who's begging for relief, or until you yourself are diagnosed with a terminal illness, it's not a priority. So I'm encouraging people to really think broadly about how important it is to have this right when you need it, because it's not something that you're going to be thinking about when you're not facing the end of life.
That's very true. And for those of us who have gone through hard decisions about family members as they have aged, this is certainly something that should be on our agendas for ourselves and, be thinking ahead. So I really appreciate the time you've taken to explain more about the Compassionate Choices organization and the Medical Aid in Dying Act. Hopefully you'll get a good turnout in the 3 places, Plattsburg, Saranac Lake, and Canton, where you will be hosting these events in November, and the same around the state. As you go around the state, that there will be a good turnout of people and it'll be a good, robust discussion. So thanks again for coming in, Corrine, and giving us a lot of things to think about.
Well, thank you for having me, Donna. I appreciate it. And I hope your listeners will tune into our Facebook page or our website for more information on how to get involved.
Well, we will certainly put those links in our show notes so folks will be able to find you as they go forward. So these conversations are a production of North Country Matters. This show is a civic collaboration between the League of Women Voters of St. Lawrence County and the Potsdam Public Library. Until next time, remember, our North Country matters.